Hey guys, and welcome back for another episode of 5 Minute EMS Review, where we give you short and to the point videos on different EMS topics. Today, we're looking at the different types of shock. Let's get started. Before we refresh ourselves on the different types of shock, let's remind ourselves what shock actually is. Now, remember that the technical word for shock is hypoperfusion. Hypo meaning low or inadequate, and perfusion referring to the circulation of blood throughout the body and its tissues. So then hypoperfusion or shock is a condition of inadequate perfusion or circulation of blood throughout the body. Now, when I try to remember the different types of shock, I like to think about the three components of a pumping system. In a pumping system, we have, number one, a pump, which moves fluid throughout the system. We have pipes or a distribution system, and we have the fluid. So in the case of the body, the pump is the heart, the distribution system or pipes are the blood vessels, and the fluid is the blood. Now, we can use those three different components to help us remember the different types of shock based off of something going wrong with each of those components. So in the case of the pump or the heart, when we have the heart having trouble pumping to the point that we do not have adequate perfusion throughout the body, we have what's called cardiogenic shock. So this is a type of shock that results from the heart not being able to do its work effectively as a pump. So that's one type of shock, cardiogenic shock. Now, if we have a failure of the distribution system or the pipes, we have something called distributive shock. Distributive shock is a broad category that includes a few different types of shock. It includes anaphylactic shock, septic shock, and neurogenic shock, all types of shock that have to do with problems with the blood vessels leading to inadequate perfusion throughout the body. So that's our pipes failing. That's a distributive shock. So we've talked about the pump failing, we've talked about the pipes failing, and then finally we have a problem with the fluid in the system. So a lack of fluid is going to cause inadequate perfusion throughout the body. When we talk about a lack of fluid, it's not necessarily always a loss of blood. It could be loss of fluid due to vomiting, loss of fluid due to dehydration, diarrhea, or a loss of blood. So when we're talking specifically about a low volume of fluid in the body, we refer to that as hypovolemic shock. Hypo meaning low, volume coming from volemic. So volemic referring to volume, hypovolemic shock. This is a broad loss of fluid in general. Now, if we want to narrow that down specifically to blood loss, such as in a trauma situation, that we would call hemorrhagic shock. So hypovolemic shock is shock resulting from a loss of fluid due to any cause. And a type of hypovolemic shock would also include hemorrhagic shock, loss of blood specifically. Now, there's one other type of shock that kind of falls outside of the pump, pipes, and fluid analogy, and that is obstructive shock. It still fits into our pumping system, but it doesn't necessarily have to do specifically with one of those three components. Basically, it's shock that results from any obstructive mechanism. So if we think about a pumping system and we think about a blockage to flow, that would be what would cause obstructive shock. And some examples of that would include cardiac tamponade, where the heart itself is physically being obstructed from fully beating like it's supposed to. A pulmonary embolism would result in a blockage that would be obstructive shock, or a tension pneumothorax could be another example of obstructive shock, where a collapsed lung has caused so much pressure to build up in the chest that it's actually pushing onto the mediastinum and crimping the heart almost to where it can't pump forward, and maybe collapsing the blood vessels that feed blood back into the heart to decrease the return of blood into the heart, which then decreases blood going out of the heart. That would be an obstructive mechanism. So we've got our cardiogenic, which is our pump. We've got our distributive, which is the distribution system, which we said included anaphylactic, septic, and neurogenic shock. And we've got our fluid problem, which is hypovolemic and also includes hemorrhagic. And then finally, we have obstructive shock, which is coming from any obstructive mechanism. So that's a quick rundown, a high-level overview of the different types of shock. I hope it was helpful and can help you as you try to break down a good memory aid to remember those different types. So tune in next time for our next video, and we would love it if you haven't already, if you would subscribe to our channel and share it with anyone else you think may find it helpful. We'll see you next time.